Hi, my name is Katie Truxell, and I decided to do the book O Pioneers by Willa Cather. It starts off, Alexandra and her youngest brother Emil are in town, and they are getting some goods that they need. And Emil's cat runs up a pole, and Carl Lindstrom, Alexandra's, I guess, her crush or soulmate is what you ever want to call it. Not that they know at the time, but he's there and he saves the cat. So the location of the frontier, and they lived on a frontier in Nebraska. I'm not sure the exact location, but they lived on a frontier pretty far from town. They had to take a horse and a buggy there, and Alexandra's dad is dying at the time. So a frontier is defined as a region at the edge of a settled area and the outer edge of the wave meeting point between savagery and civilization. So the people that lived on the frontier, they didn't have a lot. They were living off of the land. This happened between the mid-1800s. The frontier was indicated by the present east boundary of the Indian Territory, Nebraska, like I said, where Alexandra's family lived, and Kansas. People moved to the frontier. A big part was the Homestead Act that was enacted. The Homestead Act gave families 160 acres of land for a small fee, encouraging them to move west, but they had to stay on the land for 5 or more years. And after that, they could choose to buy the land from the government if they wanted to. The Homestead Act delivered 80 million acres of land by 1900. And a big important factor of the Homestead Act was that women had just as much right to the land as the men did. So women could go and get this grant of 160 acres of land just as much as men could get. And this was very liberating for women. At this time, women didn't have a lot of rights. It was at the very end of the 19th century. No, end of the 19th century, yes. End of the 19th century, so women didn't have a lot of rights, if any at all. So this was very liberating and gave women a chance to find themselves. So there were also railroads that were going out towards Nebraska, towards the west. They were creating railroads that was transportation for people. That was a big part of why people were moving out there. And people like the Fergusons that lived on the frontier were known as homesteaders at this time. Hardships on the frontier. Drought was a really big hardship that a lot of homesteaders faced. Like Alexandra's family and Carl Lindstrom, the Lindstrom family, they faced drought. Was a big problem. At the very beginning, when Alexandra's dad's dying, they're going through a drought, and Carl's family has to give up because his dad wasn't an experienced farmer, so he didn't really know how to handle the drought. And Alexandra's dad made her promise that she wouldn't give up and that she wouldn't get rid of the land. And a lot of the families had to sell their land. And Alexandra had faith that the land would become prosperous. Her dad didn't end up passing away, and her brothers tried to convince her to sell the land, but she refused. She told them that she actually wanted to buy more land because she had faith that it would be prosperous. So her family decides, against her brothers are pretty upset about it because they don't want to go into more debt because they saw how hard it was for their father to work past that debt. So, but they decide to buy more land because Alexandra has faith that it will eventually prosper. Another hardship was civilization was far away, and the homesteads were all equally far away from each other. So it wasn't just like your next door neighbor where you could walk outside and go borrow an egg or get help from them. They were not miles, but they were pretty far away, possibly miles. And also life expectancy was very short, a lot shorter than it is now, living on the frontier and just this time period in general. Alexandra's dad dies at the beginning of the story, and her brother Emil's pretty young, probably about 6, so I'm assuming her dad was in his late 30s, early 40s. It doesn't specify, but he died pretty young. Life expectancy was so short due to medicine not being modernized, and winters were brutal. Nebraska has cold winters, and at the time all they had were fires, no like central heating system, so they had to live in these sod houses, most of them. And it was cold, and the summers were just pretty much this complete opposite of the winters, super hot, and there were a lot of diseases present. A lot of people would catch these diseases like cholera and yellow fever. And medical care was scarce, like I said, and not very modern. So it does talk in the beginning about a doctor, but medicine was not modernized, like I said. So no matter what, a doctor can only do so much without modern medicine. And it also explains how Alexandra's mom dies shortly after her dad, within a 16-year period, which isn't very long. They must have been pretty young because their kids were still relatively young. It was hard to grow food if you didn't know what you were doing. Like I explained earlier, Carl's dad had a hard time learning to grow food. He really never made it past the drought because it was so hard. And this was also a very big hardship on the frontier. And there was not a lot of money. Like I explained earlier, Alexandra's dad worked really hard to pay off their mortgage on the land. And that's why Alexandra's brothers were so upset when she decided to go out and buy more land and put them even further into debt. Many people, like Carl's dad, gave up and moved back to the city. I explained that earlier. They gave up because they were struggling. They couldn't feed their families even with what they were making off of the land, much less sell it to make profit and try to live off of. This is a hardship, but not necessarily a hardship, I guess. They relied on each other. Family and neighbors, they didn't all live together, but they all lived in close proximity. Neighbors relied on each other even though they were far apart. It explains further into the story, part 2, I believe, that Ivan, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but he ends up living with Alexandra after he loses one of his limbs, or one of his extremities, one of his hands, I think. He loses one of his hands and he's mentally ill. He doesn't say he's mentally ill, it says he can speak to people, but he is mentally ill. I'm pretty sure it's schizophrenia, I would assume. And he ends up going to live with Alexandra, and she takes care of him. He lives in the barn, and Alexandra's brothers aren't happy with it, but that just shows that people really do rely on their neighbors, because without Alexandra taking in Yvonne, he would be in an asylum. Like he explains how scared he is that she's going to have to put him in an asylum. And he relied on her because he couldn't take care of himself at the time. So frontier life for women they had the rights to go get the land through the Homestead Act, like I said earlier. The duties they performed, women were housekeepers during this time, but they child reared, they raised their children, took care of all of the household chores, but they also had to help their husbands on the farm. So they did more than what men did. They took care of the home, they cooked, they cleaned, they took care of their children, but they also did just as much farm work as the men, their husband, did, or their sons. Upon moving to the frontier, the women took on many of the farm's chores, as well as the household chores, like I said. Just like Alexandra, who took on the responsibility of the farm after her dad passed, her brothers helped her as well, but she took on a lot of the responsibilities, but she also took care of the family life. She took care of the house, she cooked alongside her mother before her mom passed. Children did not have much of an education at this time. They did have one-room schoolhouses, but a lot of the times the children would start working on the farm from the time that they could walk. They would be picking food, they would be helping on the farm, so they didn't have time for education. In the story, it does explain that Emil had the chance to go to the university, and that was probably because of Alexandra's, how much the farm prospered after they ended up buying more land. And women had, like I said, women had just as much to do, if not more. The West offered women many opportunities despite their hardships. They were given the opportunity not just to work in the house, but they could also do men's work, which was very liberating for women because they had the chance to do something that they had never had the chance to do before. They weren't just confined to the house. They were allowed to prosper and reinvent themselves, do a lot of other things around the farm that weren't allowed if they just lived in the city, where they would be taking care of their children, cleaning, cooking, doing normal household wife chores at the time. The West gave the women the opportunity to have rights that they didn't have elsewhere. They had the chance to reinvent themselves. Like I said, they really, it was very liberating for a lot of women, just like how Alexandra, she, at the end of the story, not the end, but at part 2 of the story, she has people working for her. She has 3 Swedish women working for her that work in the kitchen. She has, I guess, ranch hands working for her on the farm. She really she really found a way to make herself something big. She wasn't just another woman. She was very, very successful. She had people working for her. She had 3 Swedish women in her kitchen. She had people working on the ranch for her. Her sons, they all divided up the land. Her sons were able, or not her sons, her brothers were able to have bathtubs, which was something that wasn't a big deal at the time. A lot of people couldn't afford bathtubs. She was able to, her son's daughters were able to go to school, and Emil was able to go to the university, which was a big deal for at this time. And she was able to buy her brother's daughter a piano, which was, like I said, a big deal. That was a luxury and not something that a lot of people that lived on the frontier could afford. And this just shows how much buying the extra land did help her farm and her family prosper at this time. And it was all because of her. It was because she had faith the land would prosper. And this goes back to women's rights at this time. She really, like I said, if she would have lived in the city, she wouldn't have had very many rights. But she didn't. She lived on the frontier, and this gave her opportunity to become more than what she could become as a woman living in the city at this time. The Bergesons start off struggling, but really make a successful life for themselves on the frontier. Like I said, she ends up marrying Carl later on in the story. There's some tragedy that happens. Emil is murdered, which is very sad, but they still are prosperous. They still succeed. They still have a very successful life on the frontier. So overall, Alexandra and her brothers become prosperous. She marries Carl. She becomes this very successful woman living on the frontier, and that just really ties back into women's rights and how hard it was for women to become successful, but she defied those odds and she did it. And this was all because her dad left her the farm, and it was pretty much up to her. So that concludes my project. O Pioneers was really interesting to read. I really got a lot from it. I didn't really understand that. I didn't even know that women had the right to get land through the Homestead Act, so I thought that was pretty cool. And yeah, that concludes my report. Thank you.